Good afternoon. I'm Alan Price, Director of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum. On behalf of all my library and foundation colleagues, I'm delighted to welcome all of you who are watching this program online. To open, I humbly start with a land acknowledgement to recognize the indigenous tribes of the Pawtucket and Massachusetts peoples of the Wampanoag Tribal Confederation territories, who both past and present and throughout many generations have stewarded the land where the Kennedy Library sits today. While a land acknowledgement is not enough, it is an important way to promote Indigenous visibility, and it serves as a reminder that we are on stolen and settled Indigenous land. I invite all of us to contemplate how to better support Indigenous communities and to learn how to honor and take care of the land that each of us inhabits. I would like to acknowledge the generous support of our underwriters of the Kennedy Library Forum's lead sponsors, Bank of America, the Lowell Institute, and AT&T, and our media sponsors, the Boston Globe and WBUR. We look forward to a robust question and answer period this afternoon. You'll see full instructions on screen for submitting your questions via email or comments on our YouTube page during the program. We are so grateful to have this opportunity to explore key issues in intelligence and espionage during the program. We're so grateful to now, I'm delighted now to introduce this afternoon's speakers. I'd like to extend a warm virtual welcome to the library to Mara Hvistendahl, an investigative reporter with The Intercept and the author most recently of The Scientist and the Spy, a true story of China, the FBI, and industrial espionage. Before joining The Intercept, Mara was a founding member of DECA, a cooperative of award-winning writers creating narrative journalism around the world. Mara previously wrote features for Wired and other publications and worked as China Bureau Chief for Science. I'm delighted to extend a warm virtual welcome to the library to Dana Priest. In her 30 years as an investigative reporter for the Washington Post, she has covered the Pentagon, intelligence agencies, Russian disinformation operations, and veterans issues, among other matters. She also serves as the Knight Chair in Public Affairs Journalism at the University of Maryland's Merrill College of Journalism. She is a two-time Pulitzer Prize winner and three-time finalist. I'm pleased to welcome Tim Weiner to the library virtually. He has won the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award for his reporting and writing on national security and intelligence. He covered the CIA, the war on Afghanistan, and crisis and conflicts in 14 nations for the New York Times, and has taught history and writing at Princeton and Columbia. His most recent book is The Folly and the Glory, America, Russia, and Political Warfare, 1945 to 2000. I'm also delighted to welcome back to the library virtually our moderator for this afternoon. Timothy Naftali is a clinical associate professor of public service and a clinical associate professor of history at NYU, as well as a CNN presidential historian. He writes on national security and intelligence policy, international history, and presidential history, and his work has appeared in numerous national media outlets. He previously served as the founding director of the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum in Yorba Linda, California. Please join me in welcoming our special guests.
Thank you, Alan. I want to thank all of you for joining us today for what is certain to be a stimulating, important conversation. And I want to thank my panelists or fellow panelists for giving us their time today and also their great work. And indeed, that's how we're going to start. I think it's be very interesting for all of us to get a sense of each of our panelists' perspectives by learning how they came to be interested in the secret world. And I'm going to ask Mara to start. Hello, Mara.
Sure. Hi. Well, it's good to be here with everyone. I appreciate the invitation, and I'm looking forward to a great discussion. I was a foreign correspondent in China for 8 years, and I was focused on science and technology. And at the time I was there, there was not yet a lot of overlap with intelligence. But I partway into my time there with science, I started to see these indictments brought against researchers and scientists in the U.S. for economic espionage and trade secrets theft related crimes. And I got interested in what was happening. You know, I had at that point, before science, I worked for the Chronicle of Higher Education. So I had, spent many years going into the field with researchers. And suddenly this area was in the spotlight. And I ended up writing a book about the topic. When I moved back to the US, I followed one case in detail. And what I found was that there was part of this massive shift in thinking within the intelligence community, where this argument that the theft of U.S. technology is a threat to national security was emerging. And the case that I ended up following, there were at that point dozens already. There have been many more brought in the past 5 years, but I wanted to find a case that I could tell in vivid detail, that also dealt with the technology that wasn't Boeing secrets, wasn't nuclear warheads, where you could really get at the crux of what was happening with this argument that that the FBI should be working on kind of prosaic technologies. And so what I looked at was a case where a man named Robert Moore was accused of stealing genetically modified corn seed from Monsanto. And the FBI had bugged his car and his accomplices' cars over years. So I had this amazing dialogue. And, it ended up around that case, I could wrap this larger story of this shift toward focusing on trade secrets theft, which is now a major priority for the FBI. And now, as many in the academic community are aware, the China initiative is a priority. This is something that was brought under the Trump administration, and that continues today. So my book really looks at one of the early cases that foreshadowed the China initiative. And, around that, I wrap the history of thinking about Chinese espionage, the impact on the Chinese American research community, how there were concerns about racial profiling, and, how some of the framework that's been used to think about Chinese espionage has been tinged with racism. So I use this one case of this man accused of stealing corn from Monsanto to look at some of these larger issues.
Thank you, Mara. And we'll return to those issues and what you've learned in our next round. Dana, yes. I'm going next to you, not because I wish to show a preference for the Washington Post over the New York Times. But we're going to go, but we're going to go in, I'm going in alphabetical order.
Okay. All right. Well, I was always wanted to be a foreign correspondent. So when I got the chance to be the Pentagon correspondent, I thought, okay, that'll allow me to travel overseas. And actually, I really had a great time on that beat. I found that, if you really learned about the military and military culture, it was not a closed culture like I had assumed in the beginning. It was very actually open culture. And you could go a lot of places, you could see a lot of things, you get to know people from 5 stars down to privates, and appreciate how important our defense policy was. Then right before 9/11, I was sitting up in my study writing a book about the military, and I got a call asking me if I'd consider being the intelligence reporter. So I had really rubbed elbows, I would say, with the intelligence world as a Pentagon correspondent, especially when I sort of developed this specialty that I really enjoyed, which was special forces. At the time, they were not the super secret special forces that we came to know, which are which are called JSOC or the SEAL Team 6. These were the more open but still very secretive special forces that were doing all sorts of things all over the world. And they intersected somewhat with intelligence. So I figured, how could that be so different from the military? So I accepted that. And I thought, okay, more foreign travel, more, find out interesting things. I really didn't know much about it. And what I learned very quickly, to be brief, is that it's the opposite really of the defense culture, of the military culture. It's the most challenging beat you can ever take. You couldn't go anywhere with anybody. I finally had, I had many tense talks with the public affairs person, kept thinking, if I say the right words, if I figure out the right language, if I, have the magic handshake, somehow they'll let me do something, see something, And finally he just yelled into the phone, "This is a goddamn secret organization," these questions. And of course, that made me want to do it even more because, like many reporters, I most want to know what people don't want to tell me, especially if they say, "We can't tell you." And then when you realize that the intelligence is really the president's weapon, it's the president's weapon. So it's a very special tool. It has authorities overseas and can do things overseas that no one else in the U.S. government or on behalf of the U.S. government can do. And then when 9/11 came along, of course, the war first was fought by the CIA, and then with the help of a growing national security agency. So I applied my military brain. How's this war being fought? Are they getting to the tactical goals, and are they getting to the strategic goal? I applied those same set of questions to this very secret and prohibited place to go, which were clandestine and covert operations. And honestly, it was very rewarding to be able to contribute to our understanding of that, because there were only a handful of us doing it at the time, and the stakes really could not have been higher. That's my backstory for how I got into it. It's a great beat. I'm really happy that a lot of my students that I teach, or some of them, are interested in giving it a try.
Thank you, Dana. And of course, your reporting would have huge national repercussions and importance. And we'll get back to that a little bit later. Tim, please tell us your backstory.
Sure. In early June of 1987, I was 30 years old. I worked for the Philadelphia Inquirer, and I had just published a series of stories about what's known as the Pentagon's black budget, and that is the mechanism by which the enormous budget of the Pentagon is falsified with secret compartments and code names and blank spaces to finance secret weapons, research and development and procurement, and most of the far-flung United States intelligence community. Parenthetically, about 25 years later, Dana and her colleagues published the truly definitive series on the black budget. So my series barely scratched the surface of how the CIA was operating, and this was in the months after the Iran-Contra story had exploded. And I thought, well, here I am sitting in Washington. What I really want to do is go out into the world and see a covert operation with my own eyes. And the biggest show in town was the CIA shipping, that year it was $700 million of weapons to our friends, the Afghan Mujahideen, the holy warriors in Afghanistan, who were fighting the Soviet occupation of their country. So I made plans to get into Afghanistan, which on foot with the Mujahideen, which very few reporters actually did because it was insane, actually, to do that. So I called up the CIA, which has a public affairs office and always has had a public affairs office. And I said, so I'm going to Afghanistan, and I understand you people sometimes do country briefings for reporters who are going off to strange places. How about it? I can't tell you verbatim what the guy told me, but he told me to buzz off and hung up the phone. So off I went to Afghanistan, went backpacking with the Mujahideen throughout the fall of 1987, and did what I set out to do, which was to trace the progress of a Stinger anti-aircraft missile through Pakistan into eastern Afghanistan, and to see it fired in combat. The guy missed. So I came out eventually, and after about a 3-month expedition, and I got back to Washington, and I hadn't been back at my desk for more than about a day when the phone rang. Guess who? And he said, "Tim, how are you?" He's really friendly this time. "How was your trip?" And I said, he said, "How'd you like to come in for that briefing now?" And so off I went to the CIA. I'd never been to the CIA. Through the checkpoints, into the beautiful, really magnificent lobby of the old headquarters building, onyx and marble, and up on the left-hand wall engraved in big bas-relief gold letters, it says, "From the Gospel of John, and ye shall know the truth, and the truth will make you free." So oh, that's interesting. So I went up to the 7th floor and sat down with 4 people who were reputed to be, the best analysts of everything Afghanistan. And they really only wanted to know one thing from me. They didn't want to hear what I had to say, really. They said, "What's it like?" Because they'd never been within a country mile of Afghanistan. So I went back down. I looked over my right shoulder at the wisdom of the Gospel of John, and I knew what I was going to do with the foreseeable rest of my life, which was to cover them like you could cover the cops or the courts. Cool. We tried, right, Dana?
Yeah. And your Stinger series was legendary because really, I think I learned the word blowback from that. And, that's not the story that you just told, but eventually those Stingers get sold and
the wheel came around, didn't it?
Turn against us. And really great.
And your books on the FBI and the CIA were indispensable when I was writing my own book, as somebody who at that point didn't have a lot of background covering the.
Well, the point is that we are still an open democratic society, we hope.
Yeah.
And that it's very hard to keep a secret in America. And if you, ask a lot of questions and do your homework and read everything that's ever declassified in the history of the United States, you can get somewhere.
And oral histories too.
Oh, and oral histories especially.
And the interviews you all did. Mara, your book raises many important questions. Let me take the first one, which is, what did you learn about how our government engages in threat perception, as you were looking at its response to the fact that some people who shouldn't have been picking up seeds were picking up seeds in private farms in Iowa?
Well, the story of how industrial espionage became such a big priority for the FBI and the DOJ goes back to the 1990s after the end of the Cold War. There was a kind of vacuum when, after the Berlin Wall fell, and suddenly there was a kind of not a lot of analysts and agents and so forth. The FBI and the CIA, they were just not such a draw anymore, as Tim has written about. And so there was a kind of search for, what's next, what's the next big thing. And they ended up settling on an industrial espionage and economic espionage. And so a law criminalizing economic espionage and was passed in 1996. But then 9/11 happened, attention shifted to terrorism, and China kind of went on the back burner. And so, in the late aughts, you started to see, again, this focus on industrial espionage and trade secret stuff from China. And it certainly is a big issue. I mean, in the years I lived in China, IP theft was something that I constantly heard people complain about. And but the argument that it involves an extreme threat to national security is a fairly novel one. It's not one that was at that time made by many U.S. allies. The U.S. tried to kind of carve out this stance that we will spy when spying is just business as usual. We'll spy for political reasons. We'll spy on other governments. But when it comes to spying on the companies of in other countries, then it goes too far. And that was the argument that was carved out to sort of justify why Chinese industrial espionage should be criminalized. And so, there have been dozens of cases brought since then. It's what's been very hard for the U.S. government to prove in many of these cases is that the defendant was directly tied to the Chinese government and was directly motivated by stealing trade secrets for China. And so they've ended up kind of going with a backstop charge or with lesser charges, lying to federal agents and so forth, and have had trouble bringing the cases that they really wanted to bring, which was, there was this conception from the beginning that they would, go out, come up with cases where people were directly tied back to the Chinese government, and it would be fairly straightforward to prove in court. That hasn't happened to the same degree. What we've had in practice is cases involving close collaboration between the IC and corporations. So there's a kind of revolving door. Many former FBI agents go and work corporate security at big companies after they leave the agency. And so then people at the FBI will end up collaborating with corporate security to bring cases that are effectively defending the IP of that company and furthering that company's bottom line. And so that is what happened with Monsanto in a way. I mean, there is no doubt that Robert Moore, the protagonist, if you can call him that, of my book, was in a cornfield outside Des Moines. And he and his colleagues were like literally trying to dig corn out of the ground. And then at one point, they actually sent it back to China in microwave popcorn bags. So they were in that sense guilty of trying to steal trade secrets. But what was much harder to prove in that case and in several others is a direct connection to the Chinese government, and that this was all part of some larger scheme.
You have a really brilliant section in your book where you try to analyze the short-term and long-term consequences of intellectual property theft, and which I think would be great if you shared with the audience, because you basically make a very persuasive argument that actually it's a short-term issue more than a long-term issue. Right. Yeah. So for many, there for my book, I interviewed a lot of people in the FBI, and a lot of analysts and so forth, people kind of who are very familiar with arguments made by the U.S. intelligence community. I also went to China and talked to people close to the Chinese government, and to people who study innovation in China and so forth. And long term, stealing trade secrets is not the best way to get ahead. Three years go by and the technology is no longer as relevant, especially in today's world. And so they have to kind of go out there and then steal them again. But for many Chinese companies, their bottom line is, let's get ahead now. And they're not necessarily thinking several decades down the line. But there is an emphasis in China on really trying to
truly innovate. And while there is a lot of trade secrets theft going on, there's a concern even within the Chinese government that this may not be a way for China to really get ahead.
Dana, your most recent series in the Washington Post gave us more information about Pegasus. And this is a different kind of technology, but it has enormous implications for privacy and civil rights. Please share with us with your most recent reporting, the issues raised by your most recent reporting about the role that technology plays in challenging our privacy.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And I also, at the end, would like to set it in a context of what I see is a big challenge for the intelligence world and also for us as the consumers and funders of it. I did an international consortium partnership with a group based in Paris called Forbidden Stories. And this is really the first time, I'm pretty much a loner reporter, and it's the first time I ever participated in one of these international groups, which was really wild. It was great. It was also kind of wild because we all have our own standards and our own way of doing reporting. We had a big database of information that led us to people who had been surveilled or targeted for surveillance by an Israeli company called NSO Group. They've been around for a while, and they are the product of the 8100 group in Israeli intelligence, which is sort of like our NSA. And Israel takes a very strategic view of the people who leave the agency. They never really leave the agency. They are encouraged really to start technology companies on their own, where they will go and sell those around the world, not just in this. What Pegasus does is it infiltrates your phone without you knowing it, without you actually now even having to click on any link or anything. It's a zero-click thing, and then it can do real-time surveillance of you. It can turn on your microphone, your camera. It geolocates for the people that have it. It can instantly download everything in your phone, all your media, and therefore it's real-time tracking if that's what the client wants, because they sell it to states all over the world, countries all over the world. And a lot of those countries end up being pretty unsavory character countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Azerbaijan, places, Mexico, which turns out to have a long history of politicians surveilling themselves and each other and their opponents and civil society. And that's the bottom line. They advertise themselves as a company that sells this for law enforcement and intelligence to get the bad guys. And I'm sure that is how some of it works. The biggest clients, as I can tell, are in Europe. They're European law enforcement agencies, but they do sell it to others with bad human rights records. And those people, lo and behold, how surprising, use it against lawyers, academics, journalists, human rights activists, people that are just either opposed to the regime or opposed to the idea of authoritarianism. And those people end up often arrested and detained and imprisoned or dead. So that's what we concentrated on, was civil society. And we had, I think there were 9 major countries that we looked at. Meanwhile, the government of Israel, this is considered a military grade surveillance tool. So the Ministry of Defense has to sign off on every new business deal, every new country, or every new agency within a country. So that means the state of Israel signs off. And the NSO groups response was that this was not accurate, that we didn't have really a database, that we didn't have, well, a lot of the best reporting rested on getting people to allow us to take their phones, download the phones, and Amnesty International Security Lab partners with us to do the forensics on the phones. So we actually, it was tricky reporting because you didn't want to do that too far ahead of publication, because you didn't want somebody to go rogue and introduce this whole notion before we were ready to publish it. But we really got a number of phones, and we're still getting more and more phones now that it's out, and being able to do forensics on them and proving that Pegasus was used on it. Surprisingly, the Biden administration just last week, I mean, Europe has gone crazy on this, mainly because, for instance, the Moroccans used it against the French political system, including the presidency and cabinet members and legislators. And so that's not making them happy. They're doing their own big investigation. And that's the same case in some other European countries. And then on it's like bad entities list for the Commerce Department, which basically prohibits American firms from selling any type of equipment that the NSO group may need to manufacture their product. But really what it is, it's a stamp of shame on not just NSO group, but Israel also, because this company could not exist and do what it does without Israel's blessing. And in the background here is a larger strategic decision making on the part of Israel in particular, because it has made peace. It has started deeper diplomatic negotiations and regular ties with the Gulf in particular through the sale of Pegasus. While the overt regular diplomacy was slowing down, Pegasus and how badly the Gulf countries wanted that to use against their own citizens was a way that Israel could make, could increase diplomatic ties behind the scenes. And so it's pretty surprising that Biden, I think it's pretty surprising, did this because it's not used in the United States that we know of against +1 numbers. It may be used by law enforcement. We weren't able to show that yet, or to show it. We don't know if it's true. So I would set that, though, to this larger discussion that we're having in the context of the privatization of intelligence. One of the things that happened, not just in Israel, but in the United States, we had all these people who were, covert warriors or planners or decision makers after 9/11. Then they get lured away by private industry in the middle of the 2000s, and they get hired back as contractors to the agencies. But then when that starts winding down, they've also then gone and developed their own products that they're now selling to countries of the world that want to buy them. And more than that, they really are selling their tradecraft. And that, by the way, is classified. And that should be illegal. We've had indications from the CIA that this is a big problem. They put out a message to all their former employees saying, you cannot sell your tradecraft. You cannot sell you what we teach you. When we teach you how to be spies and how to, make contacts or use a certain technology, that is not something you can sell. But there's that message is out there because that's exactly what's happening. So I think this is going to be a big area to watch in the coming years. And I better stop because I'm about to cough.
Well, thank you, Dan. It opens up a very interesting question about U.S.-Israeli relations, and given the intelligence sharing that exists between the two countries, the leverage that the United States may or may not have in pressuring the issuing of, I'll make Tim laugh, maybe of end user certificates for Pegasus. But also, you mentioned the outreach that Israel made to the UAE. We played a role in that, of course. The Trump administration played a role. Mm-hmm. One wonders the extent to which Jared Kushner knew that Pegasus might be part of the deal. Tim, you wrote an important book about covert action, political warfare. How useful is political warfare, or how useful should it be viewed by the United States as a tool of statecraft these days?
Political warfare is war without weapons. And it became the dominant mode of competition, conflict between the United States and its major adversaries, because nuclear weapons are not useful. I want to argue that we are at the end of an era for American intelligence, and fingers crossed, the beginning of a new one. Let me take a minute to talk about how we got here. The 1990s were a disastrous decade for both CIA and the National Security Agency, which conducts electronic eavesdropping, code making, and code breaking. The end of the Cold War and the dissolution of the Soviet Union had approximately the same effect on CIA as the asteroid strikes on the dinosaurs. It was an extinction event in many ways. 10,000 years of experience, tens of thousands, walked out the door at CIA, saying, game over, mission accomplished. I'm going to go make some money. The CIA in the 90s went through 5 directors in a 6-year period. The churning at the top reflected the turmoil throughout the ranks. It lost its mission. It did not know what its mission was in the Clinton years, because arguably Bill Clinton did not have a foreign policy beyond spreading democracy by selling sneakers to the Chinese and expanding NATO. The NSA in 1990 was 10 years ahead of the curve in the public domain of technology. By 2000, it was 10 years behind. What happened in between was the advent of the internet. And so far behind was the NSA in 2000 that it went dark for a couple of days. They're like, we have to shut down. We've gone tilt. So then, of course, 9/11 happened. And for the past 20 years, there has been at both agencies a understandably single-minded devotion to counterterrorism. And at the CIA, that single-minded focus meant that its expertise and creativity at its core missions of conducting espionage and analyzing intelligence for the president have dwindled. During the past decade, both CIA and NSA have had their clocks cleaned by hacking still detailed and often very highly sensitive information from about 21.5 million current and former U.S. officials, passport, fingerprint, biometric, financial data, background investigations, often revealing mental health problems, sexual histories. And among those files compromised were the security by hacking into data collected by security officers at international airports. Well, what does that mean? It allows the Chinese to identify and expose CIA officers and their assets around the world. In China, as far as is known, every recruited CIA asset in China was arrested, interrogated, and executed about 10 years ago. Well, that ain't good if you're trying to understand what's going on in China. The CIA had very creatively figured out how to recruit people rising up in the ranks and into the Politburo by paying their, what's the euphemism, Mara? The bribes, the
Hongbao, a red envelope.
Yeah. The bribes they have to pay to rise up through the ranks. And that worked until it didn't. Now, the Russians, as we know, have very sneakily infiltrated most of the computer systems in this country. And what we don't know is whether it's for, and I don't think it has. What happened 5 years ago with the Russians of pumping disinformation into the American political arena arguably helped Trump get elected. And as bad or worse, Trump admired Putin, liked his style, his autocratic behavior, and both of them had a common belief, which was that you gain political control by convincing people that nothing is true. There are no facts, so just give up, your ideals about democracy. This is an existential problem. It is also a potential existential problem that China may have the capability to extend its surveillance state into the United States. That should scare the pants off people. Now, we are at the end of this era, we hope. The 20-year war on terror definitive, who is arguably the most qualified and worldly man who's run the agency in the modern era. Bill Burns, really knows now, how do you fix these problems? How do you do the counterintelligence and counterespionage to protect yourself against penetration? How do you do it on a cyber level to prevent our strongest adversaries from infiltrating, exploiting, and conceivably sabotaging the information networks on which we run? Good luck, Bill Burns.
But can I just...
Both of you. Go ahead.
Go first.
Go ahead.
Well, I wanted to just I'm not sure that I would agree that it's an end of an era, but I like definitely the other part of that analysis. I would even say this is where our ideas of espionage, our ideas of our national security interests overlap with our lack of understanding and regulation of the technology world. So I don't actually buy that Russia bought Trump or did anything necessarily.
Neither do I.
And we see that more and more every day. However, what the Russians did do so successfully and with absolutely no resistance from the intelligence world, and this was not a secret, they had done it starting with their near neighbors, going to the west, all the way across the Western Europe, jumping into the United States, which is a disinformation campaign. You can call it active measures, not using the tools of normal warfare, but using information warfare. And they have succeeded 100%.
Absolutely.
Now a country like they are, where, as Tim was saying, you don't know what's true, or there's enough confusion that enough people don't know what's true. And the media, the mainstream media, is now part of the problem, in part because of a business model that helps all of this along, which is really the Facebook engagement business model that now newspapers have to worry about as well, which is, I want to manipulate you with my algorithms so that you will stay on longer and read more ads, and I can sell more things. I can sell more ads that way. Now it's all meshed together with disinformation. And we have to get a hold of that somehow, I think, by doing what Europe has done in our own way. Europe has regulated social media companies. They've done it, many years ago, 5, 6, 7 years ago. And we need to do that. We need to have a serious debate about how you get a handle on disinformation circulating like regular information everywhere. So the Russians have won that battle. Now, can we get back? Yes, we have to try. We have to try a lot harder than we've been trying. I don't know if that's an intelligence thing.
Oh, it's a policy question.
Yeah, it's a policy question. But this is what brought me. I'll make one final point, which is I think we have some really unresolved failures on the part of our intelligence community that until we at least hold them up to the light, we're just not going to get further, which is the disinformation campaign, why they didn't see that coming when academics saw it coming, academics were writing about it, and then January 6th. So we're learning every day something more about, in particular, FBI and Homeland Security and blah, blah, blah. So I'm hoping that Bill Burns, one of his mandates, and also the Director of National Intelligence, or somebody is going to hold somebody accountable for the failures of these gigantic problems, and the Russians just, winning this, and here we are because of it. So I do think that those things are big problems that we need to face now.
Before Mara speaks, I just wanted to interject that, when there are failures, you can ascribe them to different groups. I'm not convinced that the main failure in the run-up to the 2016 election was an intelligence failure as much as it was a policy failure. I think this book, Rigged, by David Scheimer, shows very clearly that President Obama had enough information to have sent a much stronger signal to Putin. And he didn't for a number of very interesting reasons. But one of them, I think, and we need to talk about this, is our intelligence community, which has made many mistakes over the years, has been taken to task for doing things at home. And part of the problem with a disinformation campaign in the United States is, who do you want to start playing with our popular culture and our national conversation in Washington? That's the issue. Do you really want the FBI to be involved in a counter disinformation campaign in the United? But my God, it makes me think of COINTELPRO and other efforts to engage in our national political debate. So I have a feeling that our intelligence community has an allergy to the kinds of questions that Danny, your very important issue raised, which is, how do we deal with disinformation in our own country? Mara, you've been very patient. What do you want to say?
Yeah, just to add one failure, one oversight. With some of these issues that have been mentioned, excuse me, particularly regarding conventional espionage in China and cyber espionage, the Ministry of State Security rolling up the CIA's network, as Tim mentioned, was a major development. And I think part of the reason that happened was that there was this failure to properly conceive of and to properly theorize about Chinese espionage. And for many years, there was this idea that both conventional espionage and industrial espionage would be primarily carried out by diaspora people, so ethnic Chinese around the world. And the theory was at its core, and looking back at it now from lens of today, fairly racist. And it also led to a kind of myopia that meant missing certain cases as it crops up. So in the mid-aughts, there was a case involving an American white college student in China who was recruited to join the CIA. So he was recruited when he was just, a nobody, through this kind of random essay contest. And he was asked to go back to the US, apply to join the CIA. Fortunately, he was caught partway along his application process. But that case, his name was Glenn Shriver, really sent chills through a lot of people's spines, because this is not how they conceived of the MSS operating. And in fact, they've had a very sophisticated intelligence apparatus. It's just been missed because of this incorrect theorizing. And so it's not that, espionage and cyber espionage from China, that's also written about surveillance technology. These are definitely threats. I think the problem is just in the conceptualization, and then also in the implementation about how do you go about combating those. Within the United States, it's primarily been the domain of the FBI to bring indictments of people for economic espionage and espionage-related crimes, and they've often missed. So there've been, especially in the past 5 years, there've been many cases brought where the government had to then drop charges because they just were not strong enough. I mean, there was a case that went before a jury in Tennessee, very red state, earlier this year. It involved a University of Tennessee professor who was accused of violating his contract with NASA. And I heard from a member of the jury who told me that, it was just the most absurd case, and she could not believe the argument that the FBI was making. So that case ended up in a hung jury, and the judge ended up dismissing it. And so this is, it's not that the threat is not there. It's just that the way that many of these cases have been brought in, that they've been conceived of, has been off.
Tim, you wanted to say something.
From the beginning of the Cold War until September 11th, it was an intertwined mission of CIA, state, and indeed the entire foreign policy apparatus of the United States to contain the spread of Soviet communism and to propagate faith in American democracy, and if possible, instill the ideals of American democracy in foreign nations around the world. The way in which we fought the war on terror has made it impossible for the United States to spread democracy around the world. We have lost our reputation because of the way we fought. It will be the immense task of this president and his successors to see how we can do that again. Because at the moment of the war on terror, for the first time in human history, the number of democracies and autocracies in the world were roughly equal. Number of democracies had been going up since 1945. After the revelations of secret prisons, of torture, the number of democracies in the world began to decline and has been in a steady recession for the last 17 years.
Well, I think
how to reverse that.
Well, I suspect part of the challenge also lies in how we take care of things at home. That gets back to Dana's point about January 6th. I think a lot of the world is looking at how we deal with insurrectionists and the extent to which we allow our people to vote. So the way in which we address voting rights. But I will say, and maybe the realist in me is saying this alone, as long as we're powerful and rich, and we have the military we have, countries will want to work with us anyway, despite the many disappointments we have created around the world in the last generation.
Absolutely.
And it's just a matter of power politics. All three of you, in different ways, have been arguing that intelligence still matters. The era is changing, but I'm mindful of the questions that are coming in. So I'd like you all to address how technology has changed how intelligence matters in your own view. So, we'll start with Mara, since you've been so patient.
Well, I think it's changed it immensely. If we look at industrial espionage, and to some extent, conventional espionage uses the same tools. Years ago, you needed a big briefcase in order to steal a bunch of documents. You needed the physical case that you would put the information in was just much larger. And now you can steal a ton of documents on a thumb drive. You could steal them by hacking into a website. It just opens up all this possibility that wasn't there. Disinformation was always there as well, But it is much more sophisticated in today's environment, as Dana pointed out, right? So I do think technology has people often say it's created a kind of unequal playing field, right? Where first, if you're a cyber criminal, you have all the tools available to you. It's much harder for government to go in and find those people. So I'm not sure how to end this on an optimistic note, but
you don't have to be.
I think it's yeah.
No one asked that.
I would be optimistic.
Oh, really? Okay.
Well, only in the sense, I mean, to take the broadest notion of technology, the NSA learned to do amazing things during the decade of terrorism. After 9/11, the NSA can be anywhere overhead, way overhead or slightly overhead or whatever. It just made vast advances in the way that we do electronic spying and code breaking and all of that. I mean, unfortunately, some of our adversaries did too, and from what we read, they're much more willing to use cyberspace to hack into this and that. So. But I just want to point out that the type of technology I did this one story, didn't get much attention, but I really loved it. I was looking around to say, what has the IC been doing, the intelligence community been doing since 9/11 that doesn't have to do with terrorism? And I found these great cases in Mexico and Colombia. And in Mexico, they basically had blanketed the country with electronic surveillance in the hopes of using what they picked up to arrest the drug cartel members. But really, they had the whole place penetrated, and that is when Papa was picked up, as well as others. And then in Colombia, they helped defeat the FARC by using the technology that they had learned to target individuals on a battlefield with drones, and smart bombs. They did the same thing against the FARC leadership. So both of those are good examples of the things that the intelligence community became really good at doing. And one is electronic espionage, and the other is precision targeting. Even though we know how awful these drone mishaps are, they're nothing like the mishaps that would have happened had they been less precise, had they not had smart bombs, had they not been able to significantly increase the turnaround time from information on the ground and to the pilot. So there's amazing technology advances that have happened. Now, how they're going to use that to counter, a China or a Russia or a Pakistan, what we haven't talked about is the countries that border Afghanistan, that when Afghanistan not only continues to fall apart, but then if there is an ISIS that grows up inside, we're going to have better relations. Well, we have not bad relations, but with Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan and God help us, Pakistan, in order to be able to set up, do something against a growing ISIS. So we haven't talked about that part of the world, but I do think things are going on already and will continue to go on.
Thank you, Dana. Tim, you wanted to say something.
Point that may illustrate the changes of the last 20 years and a problem that lies ahead. Dana mentioned targeting. Before 9/11, targeting had a very precise meaning at CIA. It was the gathering of intelligence to identify a potential target for recruitment for the purposes of espionage. Targeting for the last 20 years has meant the technical geolocation of somebody you want to kill. And the difference means that we are killing rather than recruiting, and have done so for the last 20 years. And the kill them all, let God sort them out school of counterterrorism has kind of reached its end point. The challenge now is, okay, Kabul fell. And it fell in part because it was a CIA war in which CIA's strongest tool was the importation of suitcases filled with $100 bills, which took an already, shall we say, weak civil society. And everyone was on the take. And the CIA had a limitless supply of $100 bills. And so the government collapsed in great part because it was so corrupt and could not govern. Well, now you've lost Afghanistan. You've got a challenge of how do you gather intelligence? Because you can gather all the technical data you want, okay? But you do not know somebody's intentions unless you talk to them.
One challenge I also think, and it's woven through all of your assessments, I think, is that our NSA may not be as successful as it used to be at reading state messages, which may mean that our policymakers do not know quite what they used to about what governments are thinking. What's so revealing about Mara's book to me is the complete absence our government seems to have, at least with regard to the cases she studied, of the workings of the Chinese intelligence service. Because we can't seem to connect people to the intelligence service, which means we really don't know how it operates. And we don't have any penetrations of value, and we're not reading their messages. There's no ultra, for example, regarding Chinese messages. Now, frankly, there wasn't, with the exception of Venona, which was actually a closed system. We didn't have that for the KGB either. But it's a lack of intelligence that makes it hard for us to assess Chinese intelligence activities. So as Mara points out, we don't know the difference between somebody is just a criminal on behalf of some Chinese company just trying to get ahead, or someone who's actually directed by Beijing to engage in an operation. Afghanistan and Pegasus, I fear, are a result of one of our long-term problems, which is that we have a hard time knowing our allies. We do spy on them, depending on the ally, but we often take what they have to tell us on face value. I really believe there's a story there of what we thought the Afghans were able to do and what the Afghan army was able to do. Maybe not, but the president of the United States certainly acted as if he had an interval between the pullout and the collapse of the government. I think he thought this was January 1973 and not, as it turned out to be, April of 1975, if you were to make a Vietnam analogy. Similarly with Israel, clearly we are not hearing the full story on Pegasus and the relationship between the Israeli government and Pegasus, because if we were, I'm not sure the Biden administration would have made the statement that it made. So it seems to be an argument.
What do you mean by that? That's so interesting.
Well, one would imagine, I mean, I don't have this it's just based on my study of our relationships in the intelligence world. One would have assumed that the United States would be very interested in which countries acquired Pegasus. And your reporting suggests that countries have acquired Pegasus, that I'm not sure it's in the United States, the interest of the United States government, that they have it. So if that happened, it means that either this commercial company in Israel is a lone wolf, or our efforts to regulate the sale of Pegasus to our allies in Jerusalem have failed. That's all. That's my point.
I mean, you've seen the same thing happen with Celebrate. it's a different technology, but they make this device that can pull the data off phones. So, if you have a phone in your hand, it's incredibly useful. And it's also been sold to authoritarian regimes, sold to human rights abusers. And I've heard from people in the U.S. intelligence community, that they're concerned that this is widely used by U.S. law enforcement, and why are we then basically allowing Israel to also go and sell it to?
And there's a history of us reacting to our allies if they do things that are contrary to U.S. national security. I mean, look what happened to New Zealand. New Zealand was pushed out of the Five Eyes program for a few years. And in terms of Israel lost access to satellite intelligence after they misused satellite intelligence to bomb the Osirak nuclear reactor in Iraq, because the United States did not want the Israelis to do that. And so they were actually shut off for a few years.
And to that point, Dana's reporting and the work of her colleagues has shown that Pegasus and related spyware are weapons, and they can be lethal weapons, and they need to be subject to the same controls as other lethal weapons.
Right.
And their purveyors should be considered arms dealers.
And they are
They are arms dealers because their weapons are being used to kill, jail, and to people and defeat democratic government.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We're talking about the democratic deficit around the world.
And there is a treaty, a non-binding, but it's an international treaty that we have not signed. I don't know if we are going to, the Wassenaar Treaty, and it is to establish some standards and some end user guidelines for this sort of. But I just want to pose one other question about U.S. interest versus Israeli interest. I mean, I am not so sure, and this is why it baffled me that the Biden administration did this slap on the wrist with the Commerce Department. I mean, we're allies, not we as in me, but our government are allies with, or is an ally with, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and there aren't very many ways that we limit our involvement with them. Our Fifth Fleet is right there in the middle of the. So we didn't do anything against Ben Salam or the Biden administration didn't either. So that's why I was baffled with the Commerce Department.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there are limitations to what the entity list can achieve. So that's the list that right. NSO Group was added to the Commerce Department. I mean, under the Trump administration, the Commerce Department added a whole slew of Chinese technology companies. And, there was a lot of noise under Trump regarding tech from China, but those additions were, I think, generally pretty sound. Like they found companies that had extensive work in Xinjiang. But even still, some of those companies continue to sell to like U.S. law enforcement. And so, right. Police around the country are still using DJI drones, for example. So it's great that they added NSO Group, in my opinion, but it's a limited tool.
We've received some. Well, go ahead, Dana.
Are there audience
Dana
questions?
Yes, I wanted to do. So I've tried to incorporate some of the questions actually in a few of the ones that I've sent around, but I'll go directly to some. What is the relationship of modern intelligence agencies to offensive cyber war? Anybody want to pick that up? We've talked a little bit about cyber. We haven't actually talked about cyber war.
Relationship?
Let me put it this way.
Who conducts cyber war? It's them, the IC.
Yes, but do we have a sense of how actively we, the United States, engage in cyber war?
I can give you one example that may be telling. Let's not confuse cyber espionage with cyber war. War has still a very specific meaning. It means killing people and destroying military infrastructure to stop a violent society or to protect your own society. Both Russia and the United States have implanted Trojan horses in each other's power grids. That is a cyber war capability that both nations have. And what this means is, let's say Putin goes completely mad instead of halfway mad, and decides that he wants to plunge the United States into chaos. Okay. On election night 2022, his intelligence service could, with a few keystrokes, plunge a major city into darkness or knock out the AP's computers that are used to tally the national vote. You want chaos?
I've got a question here for all of us. What about future technologies such as quantum encryption and artificial intelligence? What impact will these have on misinformation and secrecy? And linked to this is the question, are China and Russia ahead of us, ahead of the United States in these technologies?
I can answer the second one with regard to China.
Please go ahead.
There's been a fair amount of rhetoric about this recently. There's no question that for the Chinese government, investing in AI is a major priority, and just in technology in general, technology and science in general. I mean, it's just been massive improvements over the past 20 years from the perspective of the Chinese government. But by most accounts, they're still trailing us in capabilities. And I think there is this tendency to confuse aspiration with capability when it comes to China, because everything's always mapped out in this, 5-year plan or plan to 2025 or 2030. And then there's this other element of noise, which is the US tech companies dramatically shifting their narrative about China. Whereas even 5-10 years ago, people like Mark Zuckerberg were so keen on getting into the Chinese market and, basically just expanding globally wherever they could. Now you see this argument that, essentially, if you regulate us in the United States, China will win. They've come to terms with the fact that they're not going to get into China. The market is extremely closed. They've managed to essentially create a second internet and protect the Chinese sphere from outside companies. And so instead, you see the tech companies moving closer to the U.S. government and publicly staking out this stance that we are patriotic. Regulating us will allow China to.
A couple of here's one that all of you could respond to. How do whistleblowers affect intelligence and espionage? Who would like to tackle that one?
Depends on what you define as a whistleblower. I mean, nobody in the traitor, and so let's not define what he is, but say that his information both enhance the public's knowledge of U.S. capabilities to collect massively against U.S. citizens in the United States, people on social media, blah blah blah. But it also probably, in many ways that were never published, but were stolen, contained a lot of very technical information that that Snowden says he trusted U.S. journalists to make a decision about that. Now, what did no foreign government get a hold of those? I would be very doubtful. I would be very doubtful that. Yes, they probably did, because journalists and their organizations are not always real wise on how to keep these things away from people. So, that really depends on who you're defining as a whistleblower, which has a good aura about it. The people that helped me put together the stories about black sites, I don't know if I would call them whistleblowers, but I couldn't have done that reporting without their help. And they were risking a lot because that's a classified program. The people that know about it are sworn to, they make an agreement that they can be prosecuted if they leak certain things that are classified. They're not protected as the journalists are who report the things. So whistleblowers can have a huge, we always depend on people who are willing to, to break the law, because that's what they do when they share classified information with us. And those of us who report on intelligence, we depend on them to help us.
Do you think that there is any likelihood of an international convention regulating the use of cyber warfare? Tim, you're shaking your head rather energetically, so maybe you can.
Reminds me of during the first Gulf War 30 years ago, I called up Lieutenant General William Odom, a three-star who had run the NSA. And I said, hey, General Odom, there's somebody's trying to float a balloon about a pan-Arab peacekeeping force in the Middle East. And General Odom said, pan-Arab peacekeeping force? Are you out of your bleeping mind? I think the idea of regulating, I think that horse is so far out of the barn at this point that no global consensus on the use of power other than we can't use nuclear weapons. Everything else is fair game in this day and age.
Okay, so I was going to say almost the opposite, not necessarily to that question, but to our general discussion. Where does our general discussion about the rapidity of technological change, especially an advancement, especially vis-a-vis China? I don't see an arms race that will get us anywhere except more, accelerated knowledge that can be used in a bad way. And that, to me, leads us to precisely that thing. It means that we need to be less dependent on espionage in our intelligence world to do what we've been dependent on them to do for the last 20 years, which is to fight our fights, to fight our wars. We need to be much less dependent on them. We need to enable diplomacy and policymakers to think through these ways, to think through these problems, and to resolve them, the best we can diplomatically and elsewise. Because we are not going to win. I don't know who wins with China. They're going to win a lot because they have a very organized society. And so I don't think I think we need to be much more, we need to empower our diplomats and more to engage with our adversaries. That's all. But I think
you're right.
Yes. Although they need good information when they're dealing with our adversary.
Totally.
And I wouldn't you say, well, perhaps not. We also need to be a bit more careful when we distinguish between adversaries and just neutrals or people who just may not share our worldview, but aren't necessarily trying to undermine our state power.
Very much so. But that's a decision, again, on the part of, and it goes back to Mara's point about understanding intentions and is China solely in the adversarial camp? And who's best to determine that? I would think the policymakers with intelligence are much better able to determine that than, threat-soaked intel people.
Well, actually, there was a question that came in about the politicization of intelligence and the extent to which policymakers are either being told what they want to hear or are being in some way directed to viewing the world in a certain way. What are the checks and balances that we have on our intelligence community so that it is basically an umpire calling balls and strikes?
Well, the press is one of them, obviously, but it is complicated because, those of us in the U.S. press tend to talk more to people in the U.S. intelligence community. And, I do think we see more stories about cyber espionage from Russia and China than we see from the United States. And, there was it came out last year that the NSA had been spying on European allies through undersea cables. And, it's essentially the same thing that we have been accusing Huawei of doing. And that was not widely reported in the United States. There wasn't a lot of in-depth analysis of it. But, it becomes clear that Huawei is not the only one in the game doing that. So, the press, we absolutely need to keep covering the intelligence community critically and fully. But there are limitations to what information we get.
Well,
go ahead, Dan.
Sorry, the other overseer is Congress, and it's not always been great, but that they do have the power to it's the law that they need to be certain small number need to be informed of covert action, and then a slightly bigger group hear about operations within a certain period of time. So there is oversight. I think oversight was feckless right after 9/11, even when it came to, the black sites. The fact is the black sites did not get much criticism in the United States until the Democrats took over one house of Congress. So they were pretty much mute before that. And one of my favorite stories I ever did was about how many people read the National Intelligence Estimate on Iraq. There were 2 senators who went and actually read the whole estimate because they had to go over there in person. They couldn't bring their staffs. That's pretty pathetic.
Mm-hmm.
They are overseers, but they almost don't want the responsibility.
Oversight is one of those two-faced words. That means its opposite. It means to pay attention to something and not pay attention to something. Oops, that was an oversight. I would argue that from January 20th, 2017 until January 20th, 2021, we were in a constant state of crisis in terms of the role of intelligence in the government. The former guy did not listen to his CIA briefers, did not want CIA briefers, called, CIA intelligence officers Nazis and, jackbooted fascists, put intelligence in quotation marks, and famously took Vladimir Putin's word over his national intelligence director on the question of Russian interference. His first CIA director mimicked Trump's rants, undermined his officer. His second intelligence director, while more competent, since she was a career CIA clandestine service officer and executive, also kowtowed to Trump and did not push back when he wouldn't listen to intelligence, whether it was about, North Korea's missiles or Chinese capabilities or Russian sabotage of American democracy. We are now entering what I believe will have to be the third era in the history of American intelligence. The first being the Cold War up through the 90s. The second being the 20-year war on terror. If we do not, as Mara and Donna have said eloquently, integrate intelligence, diplomacy, and the use of presidential power, we're screwed in the short term and possibly in the long term. The image of the United States in the world has never been worse. It begins at home, as we all know. We have to repair our democracy in order to project democracy through the instruments of foreign policy. And if we don't, this will be the Chinese century.
With regard to our conversation about oversight and checks and balances, we've received a question. If journalists are dependent on intelligence officers breaking the law in revealing confidential information, isn't that in itself a threat to our national security?
So nobody said it was intelligence officers. I just want to point that out. Even though the circle is small, there are various actors in that circle of knowledge. But yes, it can possibly be, and that responsibility that the U.S. press can learn secrets, can publish secrets without prior restraint. That is enshrined in the Pentagon Papers decision. And it should be, and I know for the Washington Post, it's something we take very seriously. We don't publish every story that we get. And we do a rigorous, debate among ourselves. And sometimes we, in the case of the black sites, I sought advice from former intel people on how we should view the administration's request that we not write anything. So it is definitely a possibility that some kind of stories that are written could damage national security. But I hope, and I do think that that most of the media is always very conscious of that and tries to think it through. The problem is sometimes the intelligence, the official intelligence community won't help you think it through, which I think is very short-sighted, because we will listen to their case. But if they don't even want to make a case, then we can't even listen to it. And that has happened in the more immature administrations where a CIA director, for instance, was not confident in what he was doing. I feel like their reply was, just don't run it, and we're not going to talk to you about it, which I think is a ridiculous type of statement. So, but yes, I think that question is a good one.
I would respond by saying, look, I covered CIA on a daily basis for 7 years in the 90s. If I had a story where there was a ghost of a chance that someone could get hurt or some thing would be broken, all right, I went to the CIA, first to their public affairs office, and if I couldn't get a straight answer for them, to the director himself.
Yeah.
Journalism, like intelligence, is based on trust. If you can't trust your sources, if you can't trust one another, you're dead. And I would like to think that trust was rewarded.
Well, this has been a spectacular conversation, and we've reached the end of our allotted time. I want to thank, first of all, the John F. Kennedy Library and the John F. Kennedy Foundation for sponsoring this, what I hope and I believe was an informative and entertaining conversation. I want to thank Mara Hvistendahl. I want to thank Dana Priest. And I want to thank Tim Weiner for your comments, your wisdom, your experience, and for sharing so much of your time with us today. So my name is Tim Naftali, and on behalf of all of us, I want to thank you for being so patient. And I hope you enjoyed our conversation today as we did participating in it. Take care and stay well.
Bye, Tim.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye. Take care.